Welcome to the Social Exchange Podcast. Podcast. My name is Zach Rhoads. You're about to hear a rebroadcast of my 2016 interview with international best-selling author Johann Hari. The interview is from the archives of my previous podcast called Young Justice. At the time of this interview, Johann was actually sending his editor his final draft of his most recent book called Lost Connections. I mean it. Instead of working on his extremely important book project, he spoke with me for an hour and a half and procrastinated. If he only knew that this is back when I conducted these interviews out of my closet. Also, the book he was procrastinating on actually became his second international bestseller, so I take full credit for that. I think I gave him the couple hours of distraction that he needed to stir up a bestseller. It's that Zach Rhoads closet interview bump. So you're welcome, Johann. Johann is actually coming for a visit in my area while he's here. We're going to do a TV and podcast interview while he's over here. That's going to be awesome. It's going to happen in June. I'm really looking forward to it. I'll, of course, let you know as soon as it happens. Patrons get first dibs. Two more things. First, please check out my new website, modesofexchange.org. I'll tell you more about it later. You'll see it in the show notes. Go ahead and visit it, and you'll figure out everything you want to know. But go there. You'll find blogs from both community members and professionals about drugs and addiction, child development, and social and political issues. And if you have, it's a multimedia site too, so you'll get a range of resources, but it's also a blog site that people can post into, community members, anybody can. If you have an idea for a blog, send it my way at socialexchangepodcast@gmail.com. And then there are blogs and articles from professionals and even just worldwide experts in the field. And so anyone's welcome to write in, and then depending on who you are or what your relationship is with the topic, you go in one of three categories. Whether you're a layperson or I would say community member with a lot to say about the issue, a professional, just someone who works in the field, or somebody who I would say is a leading expert, so someone who's been in the field for long enough or has written maybe best-selling books or something like that. The other thing, my book with Stanton Peele, Outgrowing Addiction with Common Sense Instead of Disease Therapy, is available for pre-order. Find out more about the book at outgrowingaddiction.com. You can pre-order it from Amazon now at a discounted price. I think you get $5 off. Oh, actually, there's one last thing. When you listen to this interview, you are going to hear a very clear difference between the sound quality of my previous podcasts versus the sound quality of podcasts in the age of Aaron Ferguson. So Aaron's production and his music and editing ability is one reason that the sound is better. The other reason is because of the microphones and accessories and recording equipment I was able to purchase using the donations from our Patreon page. If you listen to the show and you do not donate, please consider making a small donation to patreon.com/thesocialexchange. The donation will help keep this show on the up and up. Your donations helped fund Modes of Exchange, the website, and your donations will help fund creative projects in the future. So again, help the show by making a small donation to patreon.com/thesocialexchange. The link is provided in the show notes. Now I want to thank all of our patrons: André Pampel, Carter, Vermont, Rick Barnett, Anne Earle, Inigo, Jon Holt, Laila Ferguson, Mary Kay Villaverde, Michelle, Nancy, Sean, Regina Ferguson, Tim Tucker, Christian, Thomas Rhoads, Kathleen Cochran, Marjorie Israel, Diane T, Trevor, Susan Mathieu, and Linda Rhoads. Again, you can join the club, support the show, and become a patron by visiting patreon.com/The Social Exchange. Now enjoy this 2016 interview with the brilliant Johann Hari. I'm here with journalist and author of the best-selling book, Chasing the Scream, Johann Hari. Johann, thank you for being here with me.
Hey, Zach. It's really good to be with you.
Your book, Chasing the Scream, is obviously quite brilliant, as many of my listeners will attest, as is the case of all of your work I've encountered. So, for people who don't know you, can you talk a little bit about yourself and just how you began this journey of educating the public about drugs and addiction and society?
You know, it was a very personal reason that made me want to write this book. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I didn't understand why then, but as I got older, I realised we had addiction in several members of my family. And when I started to work on the book, which was in 2011, oh God, it was that long ago, 2011, I realised, you know, I knew we were coming up to the 100th anniversary of when drugs were banned.
Yes.
In 2014, it was the 100th anniversary, and I knew in December 2014, and it was a really weird thing because I realised, so we've had 100 years of fighting this war on drugs, and I thought, when I began writing it, I kind of thought, oh, I know loads about this. This is going to be an easy book to do, right? I'd written as a journalist quite a lot about the war on drugs, and I'd, as I said, obviously lived through addiction with my family. But when I started to write it, when I sat down, I just realised, you know, I wrote out this list of questions, right? When I was first thinking about how am I going to do this? How am I going to structure the thinking about this book? I wrote a list of, I think it was 4 questions, and it was, why did we go to war against drugs and drug addicts 100 years ago? Why do we carry on when it doesn't seem to be working? What are the actual alternatives like in practice? And what really causes drug use and drug addiction?
So all easy questions.
And I sat down to write it. I just thought, fuck, I don't know if I can swear.
You say whatever you want, yeah.
I thought, fuck, I don't know the answers to any of these questions. And that was when I realised I had to really go on a journey, and I ended up going to, like, God, by now, it's more since I wrote the books. I think it's 18 different countries, and I really sat with I want to just sit with people whose lives have been changed either by the war on drugs or by the alternatives to the war on drugs. So, you know, that ended up being a crazy mixture of people, as anyone who's read the book knows. And I just learned so much about just how much what we're told about all these subjects is just wrong.
It seems like one of your major gains from the project is you sort of realize that conversations about social policies with respect to addiction, they don't need to be abstract or philosophical. Right, because there's plenty of data. You've also successfully talked about drug policies having much to do with some unfortunate American history, complete with inexcusable racism. I wonder if we could start with just a little bit of history, specifically to the drug war. Could you walk me through how our so-called drug war began and who started it?
I'm glad you said that about abstraction, because one of the things I think about, for some reason I'm just allergic to very abstract arguments anyway. It's one of the reasons why I just cannot read French philosophy. I just find the minute any argument is too abstract, you could just be saying any old bullshit, right?
Exactly.
Things have got to be embedded in, you know, I am a British empiricist. I think you have to go back to, you know, stories and facts and people's experience and scientific evidence rather than just, you know, weird moralistic or abstract argument. And I think, you know, there's so many things I learned for Chasing the Scream that really surprised me, but one of them was the story about why drugs were banned. If you had asked me when I started doing the research, why were drugs banned in 1914, I would have guessed that they were banned for the reasons that if you stepped out of this interview now and you asked the next person to walk past your apartment in Vermont, well, why are drugs banned? They'd probably say, well, you don't want kids to use drugs, you don't want people to become addicted. What really surprised me, I did a lot of archival research, and in Penn State University, they've got the archives of a man called Harry Anslinger, who I'll talk about in a minute. And it really struck me, spending so much time in those archives, that stuff barely came up, right? That's not why drugs were banned. They didn't talk about it. You literally didn't mention it most of the time in the official debates. The reason they were banned for a different reason, and I opened Chasing the Screen with this moment, which I think to some people might seem like a weird place to begin a book about the war on drugs, and I can tell some people think, "Oh, hang on, what's this got to do with the war on drugs?" One night in 1939, Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer, walked on stage in a hotel in Midtown Manhattan, and she sang for the first time a song called "Strange Fruit," that I'm sure most of your listeners know is a song about lynching. It's this idea that the bodies of African American men hanging from trees are the strange fruit of the South. And her goddaughter, Lorraine Feather, said to me, "You've got to understand how challenging this was, how radical this was to have." Billie Holiday wasn't even allowed to walk through the front door of that hotel. She had to go through the service elevator. So to have an African-American woman singing this incredibly powerful song against lynching was a really explosive moment. And that night, Billie Holiday received a warning from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics run by this man, Harry Anslinger. And it basically said, "Stop singing this song." And it must seem like a weird place to begin, because you think, well, hang on, why the Federal Bureau of Narcotics giving a warning to a jazz singer? What about a song? What's going on here? And I only was really able to piece it together through the archives and through other sources. So you've got to step back a second. Harry Anslinger, I think, is the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. He's the man who, he was in charge at that time, and for many years before that moment in 1939, he was in charge of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. He basically took it over when it was the Department of Prohibition. So you've got alcohol prohibition. It's obviously been a complete disaster. It's discredited. He takes it over a couple of years before it ends. And he takes over this big government bureaucracy. He's a government bureaucrat. He's been promoted because one of his relatives, his wife's relatives, is in charge of the Treasury Department. And he takes over this big government department, and he wants to keep it going. But they've just lost the war that they're designed to fight. And he designed the modern war on drugs effectively as a way to keep that bureaucracy going. Now, that's not to say he didn't believe in the cause. He did believe in it. And he really built this. He's the first person to use the phrase war against drugs long before Nixon or Reagan or people who are normally attributed. And Harry Anslinger really built the war on drugs around two intense hatreds he had. One was an intense hatred of people with addiction problems based on a neighbour he'd known who had an addiction problem when he was a little boy, and he'd been really terrified of it. And one was an incredibly intense hatred of African Americans and Chinese Americans and Latinos. And you've got to understand, he was regarded as a crazy racist in the 1920s, right? Which is a sign of how insanely racist he was. He used the N-word so often in official police memos that he had to be, his own senator called him to resign.
It's terrifying.
And it's crazy. And it's actually one thing that also is terrifying is the incredible parallels between the things that Anslinger said and the things that Jeff Sessions and Donald Trump, the rhetoric they both use about the idea that foreigners are polluting the country with drugs, very similar to what Trump said on the campaign trail. And to Harry Anslinger, Billie Holiday was like a symbol of everything that was going wrong in the world, right? She was a African-American. She was an African-American woman. He was pretty misogynist. She was an African-American woman singing a song against lynching, resisting white supremacy. And she was a heroin addict. She'd been raped as a child, initially by one man, and when she was 10 or 11, we don't know the exact age. And then he's sent to prison for a year and a half, and she's punished for even longer. She's sent to this horrendous convent. She runs away from there, and she ends up in a brothel where she's raped by enormous numbers of men for money, which is what child prostitution is. And she really, to kind of stun her grief and her pain, she uses a huge amount of alcohol and a huge amount of heroin. And so Anslinger resolves to destroy her. And I can tell you more about what happened next if you like. But I think this tells us the kind of cauldron of forces that are at work that launch the drug war. It's not about a rational calculation about, we want to prevent these bad things, we want to achieve these good things. It's a cauldron of hatred and really a savage assault on African Americans, people with addiction problems, Latinos, Chinese Americans. It's a kind of forgotten bit of the history. And really, it's just a kind of mad assault with no relationship to facts, evidence, reason, none of that. There's one thing I found in the archives that's really kind of bleakly funny. There's this. Anslinger had initially said that cannabis wasn't harmful and he had no problem with it. But his department, you couldn't really run that big a department on just heroin and resisting heroin and cocaine because they just weren't very popular. So he suddenly announced that cannabis was the most evil drug, literally the most evil, I think it's his exact words, most evil drug in the world. He said if Frankenstein's monster bumped into cannabis on the stairway, Frankenstein's monster would drop dead of fright. Like he said loads of really heightened things like this. And anyway, a doctor wrote to him, Dr. Ball, I think his name was, and he said, Mr. Anslinger, he was a scientist who specialized in drugs. So, Mr. Anslinger, this may be true about cannabis. I don't think it is. I've done these trials. But, if you just fund a scientific study, we can figure this out. And Anslinger wrote back something like, the time for temporizing with facts is over. One of my favorite Anslinger quotes is at one point, when he's imposing this on the rest of the world, when he's extorting the rest of the world to fight the war on drugs, several countries resist. And one country at the UN, this was in the 50s, at the UN, I think it was Thailand, were refusing to do it and were arguing back. And he said, I've made up my mind, don't try to confuse me with the facts. Which I think is like the perfect slogan for the war on drugs.
That's remarkable, if not disturbing. Were people aware that they were just being fed propaganda, or were these drug policies really being developed in the dark, free of facts?
One thing that really surprised and inspired me was how big the resistance was to this right at the start. How this was not something that was just introduced and everyone went along with it. There was enormous resistance. I'll give you one example. When heroin was banned in 1914, so before Anslinger, there was a very specific clause that was written into it, which was they said people can't buy heroin, but anyone who's got an addiction problem can go to their doctor and the doctor can prescribe it, right? Which is very clearly written into the law. And when Anslinger takes over the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, before Anslinger takes over, this happens all over the United States. There are heroin clinics. There are lots of doctors because the alternative was people going and getting it from criminal gangs and just didn't want their patients to do that. So lots of doctors prescribed heroin and there were designated heroin clinics. And then Anslinger decides to shut these down one by one. And there's a really big resistance. The mayor of Los Angeles stands in front of a heroin prescribing clinic and says, you will not shut this down. This is really popular with it does a good job for the people of Los Angeles. And there was actually incredible. There's an amazing doctor whose story I tell in Chasing the Scream, Henry Smith Williams, who I found it's almost freaky reading about this. I learned about Henry Smith Williams because he's mentioned Anslinger rants and raves about him in his archives, and I was like, who is this guy? What's the story? Anyway, Henry Smith Williams was a doctor in Los Angeles who prescribed heroin to addicts. He actually was kind of an interesting story because before the ban on drugs, Henry Smith Williams, this doctor, had very little sympathy for addicts. In fact, he said that it'd be better if they all just died. He was really unsympathetic to them. And then he saw that drugs were banned and heroin was banned. And he saw that these patients he had who'd been heroin addicts before, who used to go and buy it from the local pharmacy, and of course their lives were somewhat depleted, but they had a safe legal supply. Suddenly, these people had to pay a much higher price to armed criminal gangs. A lot of them became criminals. A lot of the women were forced to become prostitutes. A lot of the men were forced into property crime. And he saw that loads of his patients started to just die because the product was so much worse when it was in an illegal market. And it really changed him. And he began to argue for the clinics, for these safe legal clinics. And Anslinger just resolves to destroy him. He has Henry Smith Williams' brother arrested, accused of being effectively a drug dealer. And there's this, what happened then, and I think this is a kind of devastating story, is the biggest roundup of doctors in American history. 17, in the wake of the Anslinger trying to shut down this loophole, 17,000 doctors are arrested in the United States. It's an extraordinary number. Huge numbers were fined. Some went to prison. So there's this really brutal attempt to shut down this loophole. And of course, a big increase in deaths afterwards. Henry Smith Williams wrote a book called Drug Addicts Are Human Beings. And it's eerie when you read it. He wrote it in the 30s. And there's one bit where he says, we won't carry on like this, right? We can't. But if we were so crazy as to continue with this policy, 50 years from now, we'll have a $5 billion smuggling industry in the United States. Henry Smith Williams was right to almost the exact year. You know, it's so crazy when you read this. When I read this book, when I discovered it, I obviously then dug into who this guy was. And when I read it, I think it was very hard to find a copy. I think I found a copy in the Library of Congress in DC, and it's like, fuck, this would be a radical book now. Right at the start of the war on drugs, people saw exactly what was coming, right? It wasn't difficult to predict. They could see it coming. And all these people who died in the years since, none of that had to happen. And that is maddening.
How about now in 2017? How is your book in this literature, like it was to me, so novel for most people? Are most people naive, like I was before reading it, of the history of behind our current policies? Or do you think people are generally aware, just like Prohibition, when we were paving a private road to destruction and just sort of fine with the status quo?
Yeah, I don't criticize any individual for not knowing this stuff. I mean, there's been an enormous propaganda campaign to hide, to present us with a false story of what's been happening and why. So no, I don't think people are naive. People, people have a limited amount of time in the day, and it's surprising to me, and although I was always in favour of more compassionate drug policies, I've never changed my mind on that. There were so many things. The war on drugs is a really interesting subject because it's incredible that we can get so many basic things so wrong about something so important. And so, although, as I say, I was always in favour of more compassionate drug policies, there were so many things that I got wrong before I did this research that I didn't understand, that some things I got flat out wrong. That I think, no, I don't think it's that people are naive. And, and people's opinions are changing unbelievably quickly. I mean, we're speaking a couple of days after a record-breaking poll showing the highest support for cannabis legalization in American history. It's worth remembering when Bill Clinton left office, which is, the year 2000. We're not talking ancient history, although God, it feels like it now. When Bill Clinton left office, I think the support for cannabis legalization was something like 15%. And now it's, I think, 65%. That's an extraordinary transformation in a short period of time. Now, there are other very negative transformations happening in the world at the moment as well. But so it's nice to cling to a little bit of hope. But and attitudes towards addiction have just radically transformed in the last few years. People cannot say about addicts what was absolutely routinely said in the 1980s, as recently as the 1980s. And you even see that in popular culture. If you watch, I'm a sucker for, I think it must be nostalgia from my childhood, for shitty 1980s police shows.
Sure.
So if you watch like Remington Steele or Starsky and Hutch or Miami Vice, right? Which I used to watch with my grandmother, who loved those shows. If you watch those shows, a real staple of 80s police shows is, the evil addict, right? There'll be a character who's an addict, and it's indicated to you that they are evil because they are an addict. And that would be unthinkable now. You're not going to get a character on like Brooklyn Nine-Nine or CSI or, True Detective or something who is an evil addict. It would be unthinkable, right? The culture has changed in the same way that you wouldn't get a kind of evil gay, a person where it was the sign that you knew they were evil was that they were gay or something. It would just be unthinkable, right? Now that's a change that's a cultural change that's happened in a relatively short period of time. You can't use political rhetoric about addicts. Even the Republicans have to pretend to have an element of compassion about it in a way that they just didn't in the 80s, right? So I do think there's been a really significant cultural. Now that cultural shift is not translated yet into more compassionate policies. I mean, you could say it's a little bit more compassionate than the reaction to the opiate crisis is a little bit more compassionate than the reaction to the crack epidemic, and that's partly because it's perceived incorrectly that the people in the crack epidemic were African American and the people in the opioid epidemic are white. Yeah. There's mythology around both those things, but that's not really significantly translated into more compassionate policies. So we've got a hell of a lot more work to do, and partly that's about things like explaining what addiction actually is, explaining about the places that have adopted different approaches to addiction with really remarkable results, and a whole range of things like that. I've been thinking a lot over the last year. I've been thinking a lot about Trump and the opioid crisis, and there's this really interesting, I'm blanking on his name, sorry, it's too jet lagged. There's a guy, an academic, who's written a really interesting study about the opioid crisis. He refers to the deaths in the opioid crisis as despair deaths, and there's been some research indicating that support for Trump correlates quite highly with the opioid crisis, and some people have made what I think is a really ugly and stupid and actually self-defeating kind of the people who support Trump are losers. They're just dying of addiction, and I think that's a repulsive way to talk about people with addiction problems. It's a really politically stupid way to talk. If you want to, we're going to have to persuade some of those people. But if we want Trump not to be re-elected, but I think both Trump and the opioid crisis are manifestations of similar kinds of despair about our culture and similar kinds of hopelessness. Before the election, one of the things I did was I went to Cleveland with some people I'm doing some research for a different book project. And we went to this place in Cleveland we're trying to get the vote out against Trump. And we went to this place called Slavic City in Cleveland. It's in West Cleveland, I think. And I don't know why it's called Slavic City. No one knows Slavic. It must be some historic reason. And I went to this street where, about a third of the houses have been demolished, a third have been abandoned, and a third still have people living in them. And I spent loads of time talking to people in these houses, and I remember there was this one door I knocked on, and there was a woman who I later found out was the same age as me, 37 at the time. If we were looking at her, I would have guessed she was 55. And we were talking, and she was really angry. And, about everything. And she was saying the kids who lived in the neighbourhood, or her neighbours. She was just a person filled with rage. And she was describing what the neighbourhood used to be like. And she made this verbal mistake. She meant to say when I was young, but what she actually said is when I was alive. And it really, I've thought about that a lot when I think about both Trump and the opioid crisis, and I've been to other places. Spent a lot of time in New Hampshire meeting some people from, one of the places that's actually one of the hearts of the opioid crisis at the moment, and that really deep despair in our culture that is manifesting in Brexit, in Trump, in, you and I are speaking day after Marine Le Pen came second in the first round of the French presidential election. There's a really deep despair in our culture and a really deep source of distress, and a lot of work that needs to be done to deal with that. And we're, it's hard not to be, I'm by nature an optimist, but it's hard not to be pessimistic about that at the moment.
Yeah, when you hear things like that, I mean, I think there's a lot to learn from the inherent failures of the drug war. But when you talk about despair like that, I remember thinking about, when I was reading your book, alcohol prohibition in particular, as one type of drug ban later repealed. I mean, that's our one piece of evidence that we could be looking at. So I'm going to ask for your help spelling out what some of those failures were with respect to despair. But I do want to say, to be fair, I can at least sympathize when I think about it. Americans of 1920 or around then who noticed that drugs, including alcohol, they have the potential to be quite harmful to individual lives and societies. And of course, that's only a partial truth, because the harms of alcohol were hyped and overstated. But I could understand why someone would believe, rather than being a social despair sort of a situation, that alcohol was the problem. And I think that's remarkably similar to the situation we're looking at today. Was alcohol prohibition simply destined to fail? And what lessons can we take away from that failure that it was?
Well, there's another historical parallel. I'll very happy to talk to you about alcohol prohibition, but there's another historical parallel which I've been thinking about a lot in relation to the situation in the US at the moment, actually, and actually in Brazil, where I just was. I'm back in London for a month, and in the 18th century in London, this pretty interesting thing happened here. Huge numbers of people were driven out of the countryside into these kind of disgusting urban slums. And, you know, they were driven out of the countryside where they'd had communities and they'd lived for hundreds of years and they'd had meaning, into these really rancid, pre-Charles Dickens kind of horrible slums. And huge numbers of them started obsessively drinking gin. And there was this thing called the gin craze, which seems to have been a real phenomenon, where basically loads of them just became alcoholics. There's a famous painting that some of your listeners might have seen by a painter called Hogarth, which is kind of like an icon of that moment in English history, where a woman is drinking a bottle of vodka while her baby like falls off a high spot, right?
Yes.
And stuff like that did happen, right? I don't know if that specific thing happened, but there was real disaster. And if you look at what people said, there's a good book about this. Funny enough, I was looking at it earlier today. It's called Crazed, Gin and Debauchery in an Age of Reason by Jessica Warner. Really good book, that. And what happened at the time was huge numbers of people said, look at this evil drug gin. Look at what it's doing to everyone. If only we could get rid of this evil drug gin, everything would be back to normal. People wouldn't be doing this. Now, when we look back on that period of history, we see, well, that can't be right because, you know, in England today, anyone can buy gin, right? I live a 4-minute walk. My apartment in London is a 4-minute walk from a place where I could buy gin. I'm not drinking gin. No one's drinking. I mean, obviously someone is, but, you know, you don't have, you know, no one's baby is falling out of a window because they're drinking gin. There is not a gin craze. Of course, there are some alcoholics in England as everywhere else, but we're not talking about epidemics. What changed isn't the availability of gin, because gin was available then and it's available now. What changed is the amount of social distress. Right. That you know, people were drinking alcohol for very, very good reasons. They were anaesthetizing their very deep pain. It's like we were saying about Billie Holiday. They were anaesthetizing very deep pain. There's a very challenging line. I usually hold back on quoting this when I talk about these things publicly, but I think it is worth thinking about.
Please.
Marianne Faithfull, in her memoir, Faithful, Marianne Faithfull was a British singer. She went out with Mick Jagger in the 60s. She wrote a fantastic memoir I recommend to people, and she had a heroin addiction in the 60s, and she was homeless for a time. She has this very challenging line. I might be quoting it slightly wrong, but the gist of it is, heroin saved my life, because if it wasn't for heroin, I would have killed myself. And when I was doing a lot of work on the for Chasing the Scream on the downtown east side of Vancouver, which obviously a place with a very, very high level of addiction. I'm going back there soon, actually. A lot of people said things like that to me, not quite as succinctly. I think seeing addiction as purely an irrational spasm misses the point, that it plays a role and a function in the life of the person who's engaging in that behaviour. Now, of course, there are many destructive aspects of that behaviour, and we want to desperately help people get back to a way of life where they don't feel the need to be constantly anaesthetised. And certainly all that is much more harmful in the context of war on drugs as well. So add that whole level of fuck up on top of it. People turn to anaesthetics because they're in deep pain. And I've never met someone who had an addiction problem where I couldn't, since I've done this research and I understood these points, where I didn't understand why they were addicted. Now, that's not to say I didn't want them to stop. I didn't want to help them, of course. But, you know, why is addiction so high in Cleveland and not very high in Beverly Hills, right? It's not to say there aren't some people who are addicted in Beverly Hills, because you can get cut off at the top like you can get cut off at the bottom. But why is it? Look at the map of where addiction is highest in the United States, right? It's also the place where antidepressant prescriptions are highest. It's also the places where people's lives are worst, where they have the least social connections, where they have the least purpose and meaning in their lives, where they've been most cut off from the things that human beings need to not be in pain. So, you know, I think we have this kind of fatuous conversation about addiction, and I have to say, I'm going to my more controversial points here, but I'm really concerned with the way that our side of the argument is talking about the opioid crisis.
Yes.
People who would not dream of saying that the crack epidemic in the 1980s, so-called crack epidemic in the late 80s, early 90s, they would not say, so in the late 80s and early 90s, loads of people blamed the crack epidemic on drug dealers. They said, look at these evil drug dealers, we need to arrest them all, we need to stop them selling drugs, and if we did that, all this problem would go away. Now, most people on our side now know that was a really stupid way of talking about this, right? The problem was that people were desperate to anesthetize their pain and they wanted really powerful anesthetics. And if they hadn't found crack, they would have found something else. And, the idea that it's ludicrous to think you could stop drug dealing, right? That in itself is an absurd fantasy. We can't even keep drugs out of our prisons. We pay someone to walk around the fence the whole time. But more importantly, it misses why people wanted to be addicted. It's not that this ludicrous idea of the drug pusher, right? The idea that the drug pusher had to force people to want to take this drug and hijack them and take them over, which is just bears no relationship to what's really going on. What has happened though is that some of that way of thinking has been transposed onto Big Pharma. I'm a huge critic of Big Pharma. Anyone who looks through when I was a columnist at the Independent newspaper, it was a recurring theme of mine to call out Big Pharma. Big Pharma are monsters. They do terrible things. But I'm afraid to say, in the real world, they are not the reason why there is an opioid crisis in the United States. Now, there were some things they did wrong. There were some things they missold. But the reason why there's an opioid crisis is because there's a huge number of people who are in fucking terrible pain and they need anesthetics to get through the day. And if they had not found those the prescription opiates, they would have found another form of anesthetic, or they would have been so depressed they killed themselves, or they would have just had grinding, terrible depression. It is a misunderstanding of what's going on to think this is being primarily driven by the availability of the drug. And the real danger in this rhetoric about the opioid crisis is that it misses the lesson of the one place that has successfully solved an opioid crisis, which is Switzerland. I'm happy to talk to you about that because they did the opposite of what people on our side are now arguing should be done in the opioid crisis.
Well, let me ask you this first. I actually wanted to get there. So I sort of have these two different ways that I like to think about why drug laws are just completely senseless, that make sense to me. And one is what you're talking about at first, the sort of moral intuition. That peaceful adults not only should be able to alter their conscious experience at their leisure, but some must. And so insofar as they're not harming anybody else, we shouldn't have so much of a problem with it. And of course, not everybody's going to sign on the dotted line here. So the second way to think about drug laws is a more pragmatic one. I've learned this from going to different legislative meetings in my area. So the more pragmatic set of reasons is, like you reference in the case of Portugal and Switzerland in your book, so what you'll talk about, there's money to be saved and harm to be reduced by having gentler drug laws. So I wonder if this kind of logic is more digestible for, say, a political conservative, or another way we could be talking about it. I think the example of Switzerland ties in nicely.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that addiction is a positive state. Quite the opposite. Someone who is in terrible pain and needs to anesthetize themselves, that's a tragedy, right? But the solution to that is not to take away the anesthetic, but to deal with the source of the pain, right? Is to help them turn their lives around. And I would distinguish that addictive behavior from ordinary drug use. 90% of drug use, whether it's cannabis or cocaine, is just someone having a good time, right? And the same reason that if you went into a bar, in Vermont where you are tonight, or I go into the bar around the corner from where I live, the vast majority of people there are just drinking because it makes their life better. That's actually the norm for all drug use. That surprised me, but there's very strong evidence for that. I think Switzerland has so much to teach us, and it was really moving. I'm slightly biased because I'm a Swiss citizen. My dad's from there as well as obviously a British citizen, but I don't think that's why I'm interested in this. So Switzerland had this huge drug problem in the 90s, and they tried all sorts of different things to deal with it. They had massive crackdowns. They had this disastrous experiment where they rounded up all the addicts, and the police just pushed them all into one park and said, just use your drugs in that park, which just led to a kind of horror show. And kind of one day, Ruth Dreyfus, who was at the time the health minister, later became the president of Switzerland. She's an incredible person. I got to know her. I love her. She explained to Swiss people, when you hear the word legalization, what you picture is kind of anarchy or a free-for-all. But she explained, what we have now is anarchy. We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown drug users, all in the dark, all filled with violence, disease, and chaos. Legalization is the way we restore order to that chaos. So what they did in Switzerland, obviously legalization for heroin does not mean you can't just go into the Swiss equivalent of CVS and just buy heroin, right? No one's in favor of that. There's not a heroin aisle in CVS. The way it works is if you've got a heroin addiction, you're assigned to a clinic. You go to that clinic, you turn up early in the morning, because Swiss people believe in doing things early in the morning, which is one reason why I could never live in Switzerland. And you're given your heroin there. You have to use it there. You can't take it out with you. And you're watched by a nurse while you use it. And then you leave and you go to your job, because they give you loads of support to get a job, to turn your life around. And this is the key thing. So they give you the drug to stop the chaos of street use and to stop you getting a horrifically impure form of the drug that's much more dangerous. And then they give you loads of social support to turn your life around. Now, what we're told, part of the bullshit of the war on drugs, is we're told, oh, if you give people a drug, they'll need more and more and more of it until eventually they just kill themselves. We're also told, if you just gave an addict a drug, they'd never stop. Interesting thing is, in Switzerland, so when I went there, I went to the clinic in Geneva. It's very revealing. Ruth Dreyfus, the former president, lives around the corner from this clinic that she helped to set up. It's very hard to imagine a former American president living around the corner from a heroin prescribing clinic. When I went to the clinic, I was surprised, because they'll give you whatever dose you want, provided it wouldn't actually kill you. And there is never any pressure to cut back. And yet, almost everyone chooses to cut back over time and stop. And I said to Rita Mangi, who was the great psychiatrist who ran it, I said, Rita, why is that? And she kind of looked at me and said, well, because their lives get better. And as their lives get better, they want to be present in their lives more. And, it was very striking to me. So a lot of the women who'd been prostituting themselves stopped. A lot of the men who'd been committing street crime stopped. Now, there's all sorts of ways this could be sold, right? And Swiss people, Switzerland is really conservative. My poor Swiss grandmother got the vote in 1973, right? This is not the Haight-Ashbury, right? And yet, when Swiss people, once this program had been introduced, Swiss people had a referendum on it. And 70% of Swiss people voted to keep heroin legal. And it's partly because of the results. It's partly because there have been no heroin overdose deaths on legal heroin since this began. Nobody, zero, not one person. Compare that to, I think it's, 70 people a day dying on opiate overdoses in the United States. Obviously Switzerland is a smaller country, but even if you round up zero, it's still zero, right? But also there was just a really huge fall in crime. And it saved loads of money. Obviously, it costs money to run the clinics, but you save so much money in the criminal justice system, in healthcare, because HIV fell so massively. So you get a whole range of benefits. And I think that's one way to sell it. The Swiss way was basically to say it restores order to this chaos. But that has really important lessons for the opioid crisis, right? Because what a lot of well-meaning, good people on our side, who you and I would regard as allies, are saying the solution to the opioid crisis is stop the legal availability of these drugs, right?
Yes.
So throw people off their prescriptions. Now, I can tell you, because I've interviewed lots of people in that position, and I've interviewed doctors in that position, I can tell you exactly what happened. They go onto the street. The addiction doesn't vanish if you stop. You don't cut off the prescription. They go onto the street. Super Oxy and all the other Vicodin and all the other opiate-based painkillers are super expensive on the street. Far more of them transition to heroin. It is a disaster to cut people off. What we should be doing is following the Swiss example, which is prescribe for addiction. So if people have got an addiction, you prescribe to meet that addiction. And at the same time, you give them really extensive support to turn their lives around so they want to leave behind their addiction. That's the solution. That's what worked incredibly well in Switzerland. There's a slightly different model in Portugal that's also worked well that I'm happy to talk about. But that's about dealing with the underlying cause of the addiction. Because the drug use is a manifestation of the problem, right? It's the symptom of the problem. It's not the problem. Now, it can bring with it terrible problems. Of course, it can bring overdose. It can bring all sorts of catastrophes. But the core of the problem is not the drug itself. And I'm happy to talk about some of the evidence about addiction and why that is. But there's I think, a really dangerous debate going on about that at the moment. And I'm quite worried about the direction it's going to go in. I'm obviously worried about the general direction of the United States and Jeff Sessions and all the many, bad, black clouds on the horizon. But that aspect I'm worried about, because even our side is demanding that disastrous policy, and I think that's really dangerous.
I have a perfect story about that and a nice way to end it. First, I just want to say one crucial difference you point out. There's a huge difference between dependence on a drug, as you say, and addiction. A drug alone is just not enough to cause an addiction. And most people, as you also said in our talk, who try most drugs, including heroin, aren't addicted to them. I hope you don't mind a short story about something that happened here in my state. So, Sam Quinones, who I know you know, and have read, author of the book Dreamland, came to Vermont recently to give a talk about just what you're saying, how overprescription of opiate drugs is the driving force behind the opiate and heroin crisis. And it is that very familiar story of the innocent pain patient that becomes chemically dependent on the prescription that they got from some routine surgery. It's the same story that we were told in Vermont by our governor in 2014 when he focused his whole State of the State address on opiates. Mm-hmm. And of course, as the story goes, the doctor cuts off a person's prescription. They begin the hunt for more, the most available being heroin. And therein lies the reason for the spike of heroin overdose deaths. And this is another partial truth. The thing that I want to really linger on is that people who become addicted typically are not the people prescribed drugs. And actually people who are prescribed drugs, of those people who become addicted to them, they usually have some other comorbidity. But in the intro to our talk, I will have given some statistics refuting this explanation. But it's hard to be that guy who attends functions and does writing disproving very lovely people like Sam, who just happen to be wrong in a lot of ways. You seem to have made a career out of this, and you do it much nicer. So maybe we can end on...
well, you know...
Go ahead.
But I think it links together several of the things we've been talking about, right, Zach? Because, and I say about Sam, by the way, that he is a brilliant journalist, and a lot of the stuff that he writes about this is really valuable. So although I disagree with part of his thesis, he has done really valuable work on this. And Maya, who you mentioned, I think is amazing, and I love her. But it goes back to Anslinger, right? It's what has the war on drugs been about from the beginning? What it is the desire to take things we fear about ourselves, externalize them in an object or another person, and try to destroy that object or other person in the belief you will then destroy that thing in yourself. So Harry Anslinger, you know, I'm giving away the twist in my book, but he himself ends up using opiates. He is terrified of these impulses in himself. And he thinks if only we can externalize it. What is he afraid of? He's afraid of this profound chaos in himself. So he projects that onto African Americans. He says, oh, they're these kind of, inverted commas, animalistic, chaotic forces that are going to make the world disordered, because he's so afraid of this disorder in himself. It's so much easier to say it's not because we're all in pain. It's because of this evil object out there. And if we get rid of the evil object out there, the problem will go away. I understand that temptation. It's really tempting. It's a lovely story. It will rouse people up. And I'm afraid it's not true. Now, the object out there can cause other problems, right? I don't want to say there's no additional harm caused by the object. Clearly, of course there is. That would be ludicrous. But I think it's missing the core of why we're in this crisis. And I'll just say one other thing I'm worried about, and I think it's worth your listeners watching out for. So Chris Christie, the former and repugnant governor of New Jersey, has been put in charge of developing a strategy along with Kellyanne Conway, God help us, to deal with the opioid crisis. And Chris Christie, I think, is a slightly different thing, but we've really got to watch out for. So Chris Christie said this thing when he was running for the Republican nomination before Bridgegate brought him down. He said that he had his one good in inverted commas moment on the campaign trail was when he had this big viral moment when he talks about compassion for addicts, right? He says, people might remember this. It was a kind of 5-minute stump speech that got millions and millions of views. So he talks about how his mother was a smoker and she basically killed herself smoking. She could never stop, even when, if I remember rightly, she was dying of lung cancer. And he says, addiction's a disease. We need to be loving and compassionate. We've done that in New Jersey. What has Chris Christie done in New Jersey? What he holds up as an example is they took a prison and they renamed that prison as a rehab center. And now all the same people who were put in prison are now in the rehab center that's in the prison, right? And my fear is, so these people know they can't hold the line for defending the war on drugs, that right? Maybe some complete lunatic like Jeff Sessions will try to do that, but that's a lost argument with the American people, right? My fear is what they'll do is they'll effectively say, oh, we're ending the war on drugs. We're not going to fight the war on drugs anymore. And they will just rebrand the prisons as shame-based rehab centers. And they will they'll just make the most minor possible adjustments. And people on our side will back them by being, oh yeah, and crack down on the people pushing these evil drugs, right? So my fear is we're going to get simultaneously a rebranding of the drug war and huge numbers of people being thrown off prescription opiates, transferring to heroin, and then being put into these shame-based rehabs in prisons or former prisons, right? That's the kind of it's what I'm most anxious about when it comes to drug. Well, it's one of the many things I'm anxious about when it comes to drug policy at the moment. And I think we really have to resist this by going back to the underlying causes. And just, I don't think I've said it in this interview, and I feel like I'm a bit of a broken record on this, but I think it's worth explaining the Rat Park experiment, just people who don't know, and some of your listeners won't know, because I think it really is a way for people to understand this so straightforwardly. And it's the thing that really changed my mind. So if you had asked me when I started doing my book at Chasing the Scream, I've learned it's like a mental tick to always say the name of the book. The publishers tell me if I don't. When I first doing the research for Chasing the Scream, if you'd asked me what causes addiction, I would have thought the answer was obvious. Heroin addiction is caused by heroin, cocaine addiction is caused by cocaine. We're told that addiction is caused by the chemical hooks within a drug itself, right? So we're told, in effect, if you took 20 people, you gave them all cocaine every day for a month, they'd all be cocaine addicts. You took 20 people and gave them all heroin, for a month, they'd all be heroin addicts. And first thing that made me realise that's not right is when it was explained to me, in Britain, where I am at the moment, obviously where I'm from, if you get hit by a car and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital and you'll be given a load of a drug called diamorphine.
Heroin.
Diamorphine is heroin. Yeah, it's just heroin. It's medically pure heroin, so it's much better than you're going to be buying on the streets of Vermont, right? And, if any of your listeners have a British grandmother who's had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother's taken lots of heroin. If what we think about this is right, what should be happening in British hospitals? There should be loads of people becoming heroin addicts. There should be loads of people leaving hospital as heroin addicts, right? This is virtually unheard of, right? It just doesn't happen. And when I learned that, I just thought, this is so weird. And I only really began to understand. So what you're saying is, someone can lie in a hospital bed and be given loads of heroin. They don't become addicted. And yet a person out in the alleyway outside the hospital using the same drug, actually a weaker form of the drug, because it's contaminated, does become addicted. Why is that? And I only really began to understand it when I went to interview this incredible man who you should interview on your show, actually. I'll give you an intro to him if you want. Bruce Alexander. He's a professor of psychology, and Bruce is such an amazing man. Bruce explained to me this story about addiction that we have, that is caused by the chemical hooks, comes from these experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. They were your listeners can do them at home if they feel a bit sadistic. You take a rat, put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go. That's our story, right? But in the 70s, Bruce came along and said, well, hang on a minute. This rat is put alone in an empty cage where it's got nothing to do except use this drug. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically paradise for rats, right? They've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of coloured balls, they've got loads of friends, anything a rat could possibly want in life. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. And of course they try both, they don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They don't use it very much. None of them ever use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. So you go from almost 100% compulsive use and overdose when their lives are shit, to none when their lives are almost none. Well, no overdose and virtually no compulsive use when their lives are good, right? That tells us something. There's loads of human examples. I think we've been talking about human examples through this whole conversation, and so the thing I always say about this is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. That's not to devalue sobriety. Sobriety has a lot of value for a lot of people. But and I think that tells us, a lot of people, that woman I met on that street in Cleveland is living in the equivalent of that bear cage where she's got fucking nothing, right, except her painkillers. And a lot of people feel like that, and a lot of people who are in situations a lot less desperate than if you're living in Slavic City in Cleveland are facing similar really desolate situations. And we've got to be looking at those deep underlying causes, which are not just poverty. They're about profound disconnection from other people, from meaning, from purpose, from meaningful values, from a sense of the future, a sense of a hopeful future, these are really deep in our culture, and they are manifesting in all sorts of pathologies, one of which is your president, one of which is opioid addiction, one of which is the absolutely epidemic rates of depression and anxiety. These things are all interconnected, and the massive rise in other addictions like gambling addiction and other forms of compulsive behaviours, which I think tell us a lot about addiction, because, of course, there's no chemical involved in gambling addiction, right? You don't snort a roulette wheel, you don't inject a pack of cards.
You don't have to put a single thing in your body to become addicted to it. Yeah.
Exactly. In Vegas, when I was doing the research for Chasing the Scream, in Vegas, I went to, there's a guy, a really nice guy, whose name I can't remember terribly, who runs the Problem Gambling Center in Vegas. And I went, and they let me, with the permission of the people there, they let me sit in on one of their Gamblers Anonymous meetings. And I can tell you that go to any meeting at Gamblers Anonymous, they are as addicted as any heroin addict you will ever meet. And sometimes people do this bizarre bullshit dodge where they say, oh, but what you're addicted to is the dopamine hit in your brain, which is just, I think you've talked to Carl Hart, haven't you? This is just fucking illiteracy when it comes to neuroscience. Everything pleasurable you do, everything you ever do, pleasurable or not, has a chemical effect in the brain, right? It's a nonsense to just say, therefore you're addicted to a dopamine hit. Anything pleasurable you ever do gives you a dopamine hit, right? There are no humans alive who don't get dopamine hits as pleasure, when they do something they like. So the idea that would be uniquely the case with gambling addiction is absurd nonsense, right? If you can have all of the addiction and none of the chemical hooks, that tells us how much we've overrated the role of chemical hooks, overstated the role of chemical hooks. It doesn't mean chemical hooks play no role. They do play some role. Some people who are addicted are very afraid of withdrawal. Withdrawal is not a trivial thing, but it's not the primary avoidance of withdrawal is not the primary driver of why people become and remain addicted. That's very, very clear. And I'm glad you spoke to Mark. I think he's a wonderful person. Just people who don't know, he's a brilliant neuroscientist in the Netherlands and a friend of mine. And I really like our little. It's a happy thought, maybe. I really like the little circle of addiction dissidents and drug war dissidents. I've been involved in my life in various kind of left-wing causes, or not that the war. I don't think this debate is actually necessarily left-wing. There are plenty of really good conservatives and libertarians on our side on this, but I've been involved in lots of kind of reform causes in my life, and this one has the highest proportion of just good, smart, sensible, kind people, and the lowest proportion of kind of narcissists and assholes of any reform movement I've ever been involved in.
I agree.
In fact, I don't know any who are narcissists and assholes. So I think it's a wonderful movement for people to get involved in. And it's so when you made that point to Sam Quinones, what did he say? How did he respond?
I didn't make it to him, so I made it to the legislator in my area. Right. So he was doing a Q&A, but it was prescribed. Right.
That's interesting. I'm surprised because I think I think Sam is a decent guy, and I think he's a good journalist.
I think so, too.
I don't want to disparage. It's not. I don't think he's a. I don't even think most of the people who support prohibition, they're not. It's not wickedness. I understand where they're coming from. It's not. I think they're willfully blinding themselves. Not Sam, but I think these people are willfully blinding themselves to the evidence, and I can understand why people prefer the story that Sam is telling. Right, a lot of people prefer the story Sam is telling. By the way, I should say I haven't read all of his books, so I don't want to. John Oliver would be another example. Who did John Oliver, I think, is a fantastic person and a brilliant broadcaster, but did this, I think, quite wrong-headed. I mean, no one would do this with alcoholism, right? No one would say the head of Smirnoff is responsible for alcoholism, and if only evil Smirnoff were made to withdraw their product, alcoholism would go away, right? Even if I say that to you, everyone listening to this will know how stupid and fatuous a thing that would be to say, right? Anyone who's ever met an alcoholic would know how stupid and fatuous a thing that is to say. And yet that is basically the main argument the reform movement is making about opiate. Another fantastic and wonderful writer, Herman Lopez, who writes for Vox, has written this thing, again, brilliantly written. He's a brilliant journalist, but I think really mistaken, saying, I need to read it more carefully. I just read it quickly the other day, but or yesterday, I think, but saying, the opioid crisis has made him rethink his support for legalization and because Big Pharma will just necessarily hijack legalization. I think it's just very wrong-headed. It's a counsel of despair. It's a misunderstanding of what's going on. And it's a denial of the places that have succeeded, like Switzerland. You know, it's amazing to me how Switzerland is just not part of the debate. It's the one place that has reduced, within the legal system, opioid deaths to 0. Right? Yeah. 0 is a pretty low number. I should worth pointing out there is still a very small illegal market, and there are still some deaths in that. But the illegal market shrank significantly as well, because most people prefer to get a legal product than an illegal product. So it's not that there's no opioid deaths, that wouldn't be true, but there's no opioid deaths within the legal system, and there's been a massive reduction within the prohibited system. So, you know, at some point in these debates, we have to come back to the real world. You know, and we can go off on these delusions that make us feel better if we want to, but where does it leave us? You know, the crisis is growing, right? It's not, these delusions are not preventing these problems, they are increasing it. And they're also telling people with addiction problems a really disempowering story about themselves, right? Because what they're saying is, you've been taken over by these evil big companies, and these chemical hooks have kind of hijacked your body and your brain. None of that's true. I mean, of course, chemical hooks play a minor role. I'm happy to talk about that if you want. But the truth is, you know, I think that's actually quite disempowering, because, you know, what are you meant to do with that story? Whereas actually, if you're, quite apart from the fact that it's wrong, if your addiction is actually caused by profound disconnection, you know, we can all begin the process of reconnection, right? And that helps if you're helped to do it, like in Switzerland. But reconnection is available to all of us. So I think we need to we're really, you know, I'm by nature an optimist, and I'm a bit pessimistic. And normally I'm I am optimistic in the sense that in the medium term, this war has failed, it's been a disaster, and more people are seeing the light. But then you get something like this debate, and you just think, oh God. So many. I thought we'd gone beyond some of these simplistic ideas, and it's like, nope, there they are, right at the heart of the reform movement.
I think it is worth it to, if I can smuggle in another point. I know that we've gone for quite some time.
Take as long as you want. I've got plenty.
You know, you mentioned John Oliver, and I mentioned Sam Quinones, and those are two very people of high intellect, and both of them, I would even say, I know that they appeal to facts. So it made me wonder, where are we going wrong here? I mean, it seems like nuances, but they're actually really big differences, very important to understand and nail down on. And it's something that you actually talked about. Now, I don't remember now if this was in the book or in a talk that I heard with you, where you mentioned 90% of the facts are coming from NIDA, who do have interests in creating the narrative that they want to create. How do we battle an agency that is, you know, doing study? It's not that they're wrong per se, and it's not that they're crooked scientific studies, but it certainly does paint a narrative that we can't seem to kick.
Yeah, Carl Hart is writing a book about this that I can't wait for. I think it'll be a really important book. I love Carl Hart. So just to explain to people, NIDA is the National Institute of Drug Abuse. It's actually emerged out of an institution that was set up by Harry Anslinger. Partly, they took over. Basically, Harry Anslinger set up this kind of bogus. This was bogus. I'm not saying NIDA was bogus. It's not. Harry Anslinger set up this bogus drug research facility in Lexington, Kentucky, which he claimed was a rehab center that cured 99.9% of addictions. Literally claimed that. Some people will know it. It's famous because William Burroughs in Junkie. William Burroughs was sent there, and in his novel Junkie, he described he describes Lexington. That's the place I'm talking about. And then NIDA took over those facilities when they were set up by Richard Nixon in the 70s. And they were set up Nixon sets them up to be a scientific institute to investigate the problems of drug addiction. And it was clearly set up to legitimate the war on drugs. And I interviewed the guy, what's his name? I interviewed him in Sweden. The guy who Nixon puts in charge of setting up NIDA, who's bonkers, absolutely bonkers, quite a nice man, but completely raving mad. But anyway, so NIDA now funds 90% of all the research into prohibited drugs in the world, right? Not in the United States, in the world, funds or co-funds, or partially funds. So it basically means almost everyone doing research in this field takes money from NIDA at some point in their career. And as Carl can explain to you better than I can, that is there's a political limitations on where that research will go. So I went and interviewed a guy called Eric Sterling, who you should definitely talk to. He's fascinating. Eric is the guy who interviewed him in DC. Eric wrote the drug laws for the United States from 1979 to 1989. He was the lawyer on the House subcommittee who literally, so the lawmakers say what they want the law to be, and then he would write the actual, he formulates it into legally acceptable language. And so he was there for all these private conversations. And he said, firstly, the science just has no effect whatsoever on how the drug laws are written, none. But he said, they appoint NIDA, right? The head of NIDA, currently Nora Volkow, the great-granddaughter of Leon Trotsky, by a weird historical coincidence. What Eric said is, if the head of NIDA was to start talking about the social causes of addiction, for example, he said, well, she would know not to do that because obviously any head of NIDA knows not to do that. But in the extremely unlikely event that they did, they'd just be called before a Senate subcommittee and asked, have you gone mad? And they'd be fired, right? Sure. So they've internalized that there are things you look at and things you don't look at. And I can't tell you how many scientists off the record talk rage about NIDA and what NIDA will fund and what NIDA won't fund. Mm-hmm. Some scientists say they do good work. And I want to say it's absolutely not the case that NIDA does fraudulent research or anything like that. That is not what I'm saying. That's that they do good, they overwhelmingly fund good, solid scientific research. But it's looking at a very, very narrow aspects of the problem. They fund virtually nothing to do with the social causes of addiction. They fund virtually... I was recently... I don't know if I can... It was a private thing, so I probably shouldn't say who organised it, but I was recently in San Francisco at a... How do you describe it? A day-long kind of conference/symposium of lots of kind of scientists and people who are working on addiction and depression and anxiety. And honestly, it was like... It was so bizarre. So I don't think this was by design. By chance, I was the last speaker that day. And I sat the whole day, and these were like really, really some of the leading scientists in the United States on these questions. And not once did any of them mention any causes of addiction or depression or anxiety that were not internal brain causes. Actually, to be fair, one of them did mention childhood trauma. But apart from him, so if all you knew about addiction was your evidence from this conference, you would think it was a spontaneous brain malfunction. And I can't remember if I said this at the end or if I just wanted to say it. I think I said it. By coincidence, we were like having this conference a short walk from the Tenderloin, right, which is most of your listeners will know is a notorious part of San Francisco, with notorious in inverted commas, with a very high level of addiction. I spent a lot of time there interviewing people with addiction problems and the people who work with them. And what I think I said or wanted to say was, instead of me speaking, why don't we just walk over to the Tenderloin and everyone should just sit with the first addicted person they meet and just talk to them about their lives. And then try to tell them that the reason they're addicted is because of some problem with their amygdala, right? Sure. It's an absurd way of talking about people's distress. Now, I'm not saying there are not brain changes, and Mark Lewis can talk very well about this, and Carl Hart, and all sorts of very distinguished people on our side. Of course, there are brain changes that occur during addiction. There are brain changes, whatever you do, everything you do in life. Of course, there are brain changes. But the idea that is the driver, it can be a contributory factor. The idea that is the driver of the addiction crisis. And it's just by coincidence, it happens to be rural New Hampshire and the South Bronx, where people's brains have mysteriously mutated in this way that they're not doing on the Upper East Side or in Beverly Hills. What a curious coincidence that is. To me, this is such a mad way of talking. It's rather like the way of the blaming Big Pharma primarily for the addiction crisis. The thing it made me think of, and this is slightly hyperbolic, but the fact that they've so internalized these ideology that they can't see these blindingly obvious things in front of them. The thing it made me think of is science conferences in the Soviet Union. There's what's his name? The guy who's Stalin, Lysenko. So Stalin famously commissions this. Stalin thought that Darwinian, I might be remembering some of this wrong, it's years since I read about it, but Stalin thought that Darwinian evolution was like an overly capitalist way of describing the world. So he basically commissions Lysenko to create this absurd and deranged ideological view about how plants grow and things like that. And of course it leads to an absolute disaster, and then no one in the Soviet Union can even say that it's a disaster because they've so internalized the ideology that they're not allowed to comment on it. And I always thought the irony of Nora Volkow being Tolstoy's great-granddaughter is she's actually the great-granddaughter of Lysenko spiritually, right? Yeah. It's the internalizing these ideological values and internalizing these blinkers on what you can see, and then then you're blinded to the things that are right in front of you. So you can't even see the Tenderloin district. You can't even see the obvious reality of people's lives there. Instead, you just
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go on. I was just going to rant and rave further.
I was just going to attack on. It's almost, you're probably going to see the same brain changes in people who are painting a single narrative as you will in somebody who's addicted. Despite the negative consequences part, you have to have some relationship with the truth to know that it's a negative consequence. But it really is irony, and it's a particularly poor way to conduct science. Like you said, it's not that it's dishonest. It's just that it's so narrow and unimpressive.
Well, I mean, the people who've done an amazing job on this. So Carl Hart is just become the head of the Department of Psychology at Columbia University in New York, and who wrote a fantastic book about this called High Price. Yeah. And Mark Lewis, who's written two really good books on this, The Biology of Desire and
Memoirs of an Addicted Brain.
Memoirs of an Addicted Brain, both of which are really good on just debunking. And actually, this is one of the things I get most on the Chasing the Scream has a Facebook page. It's just facebook.com/Chasing the Scream. It's like, but what about the brain changes? And it's just like, London taxi drivers have to memorize the map of London. They have to do this really difficult test called the Knowledge, where they have to memorize the map of London. They're examined on it. And if you do brain scans of London taxi drivers, they have their brain looks different to my brain and your brain, right? Because they've had to memorize this very difficult, enormous map of a city of 8 million people. It makes as much sense to say being a London taxi driver is a brain disease on that basis, right?
It's a great point.
It's a complete misunderstanding of everything you do changes your brain. If I start lifting weights, my arms will get bigger. I don't. My arms will get bigger, right? It doesn't mean I've got an arm disease. Your brain changes according to how you use it. Your brain reshapes itself according to experience. It's just a very uncontroversial scientific point. It's called neuroplasticity. No scientist disputes this. No serious scientist disputes it. So as Mark puts it, and I've spent a lot of time discussing this with him, the mistake Nora Volkow makes and Nida make is not to say the brain changes during addiction. Of course it does. Well, the mistake is to think that that neuroplasticity ends at the point of addiction.
Exactly. Yeah.
That of course the brain changes during addiction, and then if you stop being addicted, it will change again. Now of course there's it's a scandal how many rehab centres. I can't tell you how much. So you caught me on an irritable day today, but it's a scandal how many rehab centres in the United States teach this utterly unscientific bullshit about, your brain has been hijacked, your brain has been taken over. The brains of addicts are just different to the brains of non-addicts. I can't tell you how many people I've met who've been told that in rehab centres. It sends Mark and Carl into apoplexy when I talk to them about it. It's a really pernicious, false thing to tell. And it keeps people addicted, because what are you going to do then? Oh, right, so your brain is just different, is it? It's a profoundly disempowering. Not only is it a lie. Well, let's give them the benefit of the doubt and assume it's not a lie, but just they just don't know anything, right? So it's a falsehood, not a lie. But it's a falsehood that's profoundly disempowering. The truth is much more empowering. Yeah, your brain will have changed when you become addicted, and it can change again. It can change back. That's the truth, right? That's much more empowering to tell people. And it happens to have the benefit of being true, which is always nice.
It seems as though you can't make choices when you're in that state, which is why it's, of course, able to continue. But, of course, choice is just not all or nothing. It's hard to make choices that are appropriate for long term when you're in a state of addiction. But you said the brain is plastic. So, yeah.
Well, I think the most valuable thing to say about choice is, I'm not a Marxist, I've never been a Marxist, but Karl Marx said, man makes history, but not in circumstances of his own choosing. And I think that's true of people in the throes of addiction, right? You make choices, but not in circumstances of your own choosing.
That's right.
And you know, this is why the single best thing for places that have succeeded in reducing addiction, like Portugal and Switzerland, are the places that have changed the environment, right? It's not just about lecturing. You know, imagine lecturing the rat in the isolated cage. You know, rat, you need to pull yourself together. You need to do a moral inventory of your failings, right. And then maybe you'll stop turning in your isolation and pain to this bottle. Fuck that. What you do is give the rat a better cage, right? And then it's gonna. I mean, I'm being slightly hyperbolic and jocular, but the point about environmental change is, and to be fair, some of those insights are incorporated into 12 Steps programs. It's why 12 Steps programs talk about people, places, and things.
Yeah, but the things that they get right are by chance. You know, that's not a...
I don't know. I think it's slightly more than chance. I think there is some genuine insight in those. I mean, I have some disagreements with the theology of 12 Steps programs. I don't have as many as our friend Stanton Peele, but there are. It's hard to imagine anyone could have as many as Stanton. But
we've had many conversations about that. Yeah.
yeah. That's a subject for a whole other podcast.
So, what is a good way to get society in general to get one foot in front of the other and start going in a positive direction that values honesty, truth, and the reduction of harm? And just human flourishing. What do we need to do next?
Stop copying the places that have failed and start copying the places that have succeeded. So, and I don't think a focus just on reason or facts is going to get us there. If reason or facts won arguments, then we'd be doing a lot about global warming and Donald Trump would not be the president of the United States. Much more potent. There's a great line, Irving Yalom, the psychoanalyst, said once, reason is always a slave of the passion, so we need to turn reason into a passion. And I think part of the way you do that is through building compassion. And so for Portugal, for example, in the year 2000, Portugal had this horrendous drug problem. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin. Every year they tried the war on drugs more, they arrested and imprisoned more people. Every year the problem got worse until one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition basically got together and said, look, we can't go on like this, what are we going to do? So they decided to set up a panel of scientists and doctors and they basically said to them, look, you guys go away, look at all the best scientific evidence, figure out what would genuinely solve this problem, then come back and tell us what to do. And we've agreed in advance, we'll do whatever you recommend. So the panel went away, led by an amazing man I got to know called João Goulão, who you should talk to as well. He's an extraordinary person, João. It came back and said, decriminalise everything, from cannabis to crack, the whole lot. But, and this is crucial, take all the money we currently spend on fucking people's lives up and spend it instead on turning their lives around.
Is that verbatim?
So, no. No. Yeah, that was not the official recommendation. What was I trying to think what the Portuguese word for fucking it up is? It's interesting because what they did is not really what we think of as drug treatment. They did a little bit of rehab, a little bit of psychological support. Biggest thing they did was a huge program of job creation. Say you used to be a mechanic, they go to a garage and they say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to say to every addict in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, we want you back. And, you know, the results are really clear. In the decade afterwards, injecting drug use in Portugal fell by 50%. Overdose massively fell. HIV massively fell. Street crime massively fell. You know, at some point, we have to see that shame-based, stigma-based policies, you know, you can make a moral argument, you can say they're cruel. They don't work. Comprehensively fail. They make the problem worse. For all the reasons we've been talking about. Once you understand that pain is the driver of addiction, you understand why inflicting more pain on people in addiction, in state of addiction, makes them, it's not just we say that fails, it's worse than that. It makes the problem worse. So, you know, at some point, we can move to seeing the evidence that compassionate policies work. And, you know, I've lived through an extraordinary change in my lifetime, right? I'm 38 years old now. I'm gay. When I was, I recently showed one of my teenage nephews some of the things that were said in on the front pages of British and American newspapers when I was a kid about gay people, right? And they literally couldn't believe it. Right? They were like, did people ring the police? If you show any American teenager, for example, very first time AIDS is ever talked about at a White House press conference, the Reagan's press secretary is asked about it, and he makes a joke. He says something like, I'm probably remembering this slightly wrong, but people can look at it on YouTube. He makes a joke about anal sex, and the entire White House press corps cracks up. That's the first time AIDS is mentioned, right? Ha ha, gay people dying, funny, right? Don't they like assholes? That's but the gist of it, right? That no American teenager, you could find me the fucking craziest right-wing Republican, young Republican, they will be shocked when they see that, right? So I have lived through extraordinary changes in my lifetime, and I'm not that old, just remarkable changes. So I'm by default an optimist because I never even heard of the concept of gay marriage until I was in my early 20s. That it didn't even occur to me as a concept. Why? How could you do that, right? So incredible changes can happen in very short periods of time when you appeal to people's goodness and decency and love and compassion. I've seen that happen, and it can happen again. It's happened many times in history, and it can happen again if enough people band together and fight for it. But we have to band together and fight for it. It doesn't just happen spontaneously, right? It's not like one day people like Ronald Reagan's press secretary thought, oh, shall we just be nice to gay people instead? Of course not. It's because huge numbers of gay people and huge numbers of straight people who loved them and opened their hearts to them fought for something better. And as a result, we're much more civilized people now. So it can happen.
I think that's an empowering place to end, if not something that listeners will have to resolve, and hopefully that'll empower them to take steps in their lives. Surely I encourage people to read your book, Chasing the Scream. Is there any new work that you've published or work to look forward to that you'd like to make my listeners aware of?
I am literally taking a break. You are an elaborate form of procrastination for me, Zach, because I'm literally tomorrow have to submit my next book, which I'm not meant to talk about yet.
I'll just bring you down with
it'll
me.
Be out in January, but my publisher tells me if I talk about it. And I'm also working on another book that will take much longer as well. So yeah, I've got another book coming out in January. What else could they look at? I had a piece in the Los Angeles Times recently about the opioid crisis. What else? I've been a bit out of it. I've been traveling for 3 months doing some research, so I've been a little bit out of the loop. So I think that's pretty much, my book. Did an interview about Anslinger, but it's basically what I said to you on the media, the WNYC show that's getting some nice responses. But yeah, I'm a little bit drugged out.
Well, I'm glad I could be just some form of relief from your hard work there. Hopefully, though, a lot of people have read your work. Some people know you as, when I say that I'm interviewing you, they'll say, I don't know who that sounds familiar. And then they realize, is he the TED Talk guy? Hopefully, I've just introduced people to the man behind the meme.
I was on a tram in San Francisco recently, and this guy was staring at me, really, really staring at me. And at first I thought, is he trying to hit on me? But it didn't look like a kind of alluring stare. And I thought, this is a bit creepy. Is this like a crazy person? And then after we've been sitting there for 20 minutes, he came up to me and said, "You, addiction man." And I said, "Hello." And he hugged me and said, "Thank you, I like your talk." And then just walked off. So, yeah, it was, I'm happy to, that's fine. I'm happy to be...
Addiction Man that's got to be a new Marvel superhero. Johann Hari, you are a remarkable writer. You're thoughtful and honest, and it's been a true pleasure to speak with you tonight.
Oh, it's been totally my pleasure. Send my love to Stanton. Anyway, great to talk to you. I'm going to return to my my menacing deadline, but it was really good to talk to you. Anytime you need any help or anything, let me know. And if you want any introductions to any of the people we talked about, just let me know and I'll give you an email intro.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I think I made 4 new contacts tonight, so thank you so much.
Great. Anytime. Great, my pleasure.
Okay, thank you, and be well.